The United States' invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 is one of the most controversial events in the country's history. In the wake of the 9/11 tragedies, it seemed out of the blue that Bush would target Saddam's Iraqi regime, which had no connection to Al-Qaeda. That brought about a lot of theories on what the true cause of the war was. Some of these major alleged motivations are highlighted by oil or Israel. However, most of these explanations have glossed over a much deeper and more complicated story involving the United States and Iraq. That is the topic for this video, a full deep dive into how and why the United States went to war with Iraq in 2003. To start, let's go into the background info surrounding the modern history of Iraq. The state we know of as Iraq was created post-World War I after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The British inherited the mandate over the region. They created Iraq by stitching together 3 different sections of the Ottoman Empire into one entity. Their only real connection was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The southern portion mainly consisted of the C.I.A tribes, the north was populated by the Kurds, and the central region by the Sunnis. The Sunnis were put in control of the country by default of centralized location. However, even though Sunnis were the main force in power, they represented only a minority when compared to the roughly 60 to 65% of the population who were Shia. The Sunni versus Shia rivalry would plague Iraq over the course of the 1900s. Iraq was ruled as a monarchy under the British Mandate. The state was technically independent starting in 1932, but the British still retained a lot of influence. Then, at the end of World War II, Arab nationalism would start to rise in the wake of the British Empire retracting from its dominance in the region. By the 1950s, unrest was gripping the Iraqi nation, as displeasure with King Faisal II's rule continued to grow. Faisal was seen as a puppet of Western imperialism. One of the groups that started as a result of Arab nationalism and anti-Faisal feelings was the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party would not be the one to make the move to eliminate King Faisal. That would actually come from the army. On July 14, 1958, army units calling themselves the Free Officers invaded the royal palace, surrounded King Faisal and members of his family, and then shot them all dead. Brigadier Abdul al-Karim Qasem emerged from the massacre as Iraq's new leader. The Ba'athists initially welcomed his rule. The Ba'athist movement aimed to promote Arab nationalism and socialism, looking to foster pan-Arab unity in order to defeat Zionism and Western colonialism. One of the most influential founders of the Ba'ath Party movement was Michel Aflaq, who advocated for a form of secular socialism, but opposed Soviet-backed international communism. The agenda of the Ba'ath Revolution included land reform, literacy drives, and industrialization. Yet most of the Ba'ath leaders focused heavily on the non-ideological project of seizing and consolidating power. The Ba'athists would claim power in February of 1963, after conspirators ousted and executed General Qasem. Interestingly, General Qasem had dodged an assassination attempt in 1959, which was led by Saddam Hussein. After the attempt's failure, Saddam fled the country, only returning after the Ba'ath coup of 1963. The 63 coup had not given total control of the country to the Ba'aths yet. They would have to continue to fight with the Iraqi military leaders for that. Eventually, Ba'ath power was firmly consolidated over Iraq by July of 1968. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr had taken over as president of Iraq, and his vice president was none other than Saddam Hussein. Saddam would serve as VP until 1979, when Bakr resigned, supposedly due to extreme pressure by Saddam. On July 17, 1979, the 42-year-old Saddam Hussein became Iraq's president and unchallenged ruler of a nation possessed with vast oil riches and a large, well-equipped standing army. Saddam was able to further solidify his grip on Iraq through the use of brutal measures. He immediately moved against a faction of the Ba'ath Party that he believed opposed him. Starting on July 22nd, only 6 days into his presidency, he summoned more than 200 senior Ba'ath members to Coll Hall, an auditorium near the Republican Palace. As cameras whirled, Saddam staged a ghoulish purge worthy of Stalin. The president sat at a table on stage puffing a cigar. A trusted comrade then took the podium and announced that a painful and atrocious plot against Saddam had been discovered. He revealed, as if in a twisted episode of reality television, that all the criminal plotters were in this very hall at this very moment, unaware of why they had been invited to the meeting. The accused ringleader of the supposed conspiracy was then brought forth onto the stage and delivered a long and convoluted confession. After that confession, Saddam rose and listed off the names of 6 other conspirators. Thus began Saddam's purge. Saddam was a paranoid individual who saw threats everywhere. During his reign, loyalty would be prized above all else. Anyone who was even a whiff of a threat to Saddam's chokehold on Iraq would be brutally eliminated. In order to keep track of any threats to his power, Saddam created a large internal secret police called the Special Security Organization. This group tapped phones and planted informers throughout Iraqi society. Saddam was especially worried about the army, since in the past that was the main force behind coups, and it was really the only meaningful entity in the state. Saddam would mitigate the threats from the military by only promoting loyal generals, rather than professional ones. After all, if a general gained too much prestige or competence, he could lead the army to overthrow Saddam. Furthermore, Saddam would heavily micromanage the military. All orders had to flow through him, eliminating any initiative by officers or generals. Saddam's micromanaging style went beyond the military. It extended to all parts of Iraqi society. He would regularly get involved in minor law enforcement or corruption cases, as well as local neighborly or domestic disputes. Saddam was Iraq. What did Saddam hope to achieve with his power and control firmly secured? Saddam's big dream was to create a pan-Arab superstate led by his Iraq. This superstate could be a match for both the Soviet Union and the United States. Ultimately, it would crush Israel and revive past Arab glories. Saddam felt the time was ripe for Iraq to take this lead position, after Egypt had made peace with Israel in the Camp David Accords. However, before Saddam could threaten his mortal enemy Israel, or become the leader of an Arab superstate, he needed to deal with problems on his border, with Iran. Iran had fallen into revolution in 1978, which ultimately led to the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. The fall of the Shah led to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini assuming power. He was an Iranian cleric, politician, and political theorist who had a similar vision as Saddam, but different in its substance. Khomeini's goal was the spread of Islam by revolution throughout the Middle East and eventually the world. He wanted the Islamic Revolution to topple the secular governments of the other Middle Eastern powers, who he saw as illegitimate Western proxy governments. Immediately upon taking power, Khomeini pushed for revolution in Iraq, which Saddam's regime, with a heavy Shia population in the south, instantly understood as a very real threat to his power. Like I said earlier, the Shia population of Iraq was a majority of the population, and they had been under Sunni domination for decades. This restless group, along with the Kurds of the north, could internally fracture Saddam's grip on his country. In response to this threat, Saddam started his plans for the invasion of Iran. He believed once his attack was successful, the Iranian people would then overthrow Khomeini, and then Saddam could place a ruler who was loyal to him in charge of Iran. As well, by defeating Iran, Saddam would showcase that Iraq was now the dominant power in the Middle East. Initially, Saddam's invasion of Iran did achieve success, but by 1981, his offensive had stalled out. From January of 1981 until June of 1982, the Iranian forces would slowly push the Iraqi army out of Iran. They didn't stop there though. Khomeini now saw an opportunity to remove Saddam from power and replace his regime with an Islamic theocracy, and so the Iranian forces continue to press their attack into Iraq. The Iranian counterattack had gained success due to the use of human wave attacks, led by the devoted Pasdaran, or People's Army. Iran had an advantage in this department. They had a much larger population at their disposal for the war, with 38 million people compared to Iraq's only 13 million people. Iraq's counter to stop these overwhelming human wave attacks was by using chemical weapons. Saddam's use of chemical weapons was not reserved to just external threats to his regime, like the Iranian human wave attacks, but also internal threats. From 1982 until 1988, the two sides would be locked into what can be described as trench warfare with jets. The bloody stalemate led to staggering casualty figures, with both sides looking for any way to break the stalemate. Khomeini knew that Saddam had a tenuous hold over the Kurdish regions in the north, and so Iran prodded the Kurds to rebel in order to stretch Saddam's forces to a breaking point. Saddam responded to this Kurdish rebellion in the north in horrifying fashion, sending in Ali Hassan al-Mazid, or later to become infamously known as Chemical Ali. The Al-Anfal campaign began in 1988, starting in late February, and ended in September. It featured heavy gas attacks, mass shootings, and full-blown bulldozing of villages. It is estimated that between 50 to 182,000 people were killed, with roughly 2,600 villages destroyed. By the summer of 1988, the war between Iran and Iraq ended. The last action of the conflict had showcased Iraqi forces embarking on a counteroffensive to push the Iranians out of Iraqi territory, which convinced Khomeini to accept peace overtures. Saddam used the success of holding off Iranian attempts to destroy his regime as proof of a major military victory. He loudly trumpeted his army's success in stopping the spread of the Iranian Revolution by pushing Iran out of Iraq. Even though Saddam had initiated the war with an invasion to overthrow Khomeini, and his forces had been driven out of Iran almost to the brink of destruction, and ended the war with no real tangible gains, that didn't matter to Saddam. In his mind, this was a great military victory. That delusion of success would fuel Saddam's next aggressive adventure, Kuwait. After the Iran-Iraq war ended, Saddam had a problem. His country was broke. They had fought an almost decade-long conflict, and in order to support that war, Saddam had taken out loans. With the war now over, he was expected to pay back the loans, something Saddam did not want to do. During the Iranian war, Iraq had received between $35 to $40 billion in loans, mainly from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Those countries were worried about the spread of Islamic revolution, which Khomeini's regime represented. That is why Saddam demanded that the loans be converted into gifts, in recognition of his sacrifices to keep Khomeini at bay. Saudi Arabia decided to avoid the trouble and converted most of the loans into gifts. Kuwait, which owned about $10 to $15 billion worth of Saddam's debt, held out though. Kuwaiti-owned debts were not the only issue Saddam had with that country. During this time, the price of oil had dropped, which devastated Iraq's economy, since it was massively dependent on high oil prices. Kuwait was exporting oil in large quantities and refused to reduce their oil production. By 1990, Saddam's frustration with the Emir of Kuwait, Sabah had reached a breaking point. In July, Saddam's diplomats had met with the Kuwaitis, who still refused to forgive the debt or reduce their oil production. And so, on August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi Republican Guard, the elite units of Saddam's army, launched their invasion of Kuwait, and quickly overran the country's minimal resistance. In just one day, Saddam went from controlling 1/10 of the world's oil supply to now controlling 1/5. Saddam acted not only out of monetary concerns, but also in reaction to a changing world. After the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, Saddam saw the Soviet Union as a finished power. The bipolar world would now be a monopolar one, led by the United States. As for the US, he believed they would not intervene after his invasion of Kuwait. The United States had not been involved in a major war since the end of the Vietnam War over 15 years prior, and Saddam believed that the trauma of that conflict would force the US leadership to accept his annexation of Kuwait. Basically, Saddam felt the American people didn't have the stomach for war. Saddam would be in a rude awakening, though. Next up, let's go over how US foreign policy and approach in the Middle East evolved during the Cold War up until the Gulf War. At the end of World War II, the United States found itself in a position it had never been before, a true world power with global responsibilities. The United States wasn't the sole power, though, as the Soviet Union had brought half of Europe under the Iron Curtain. The spread of communism looked like it was all-consuming. That put US leadership, led by Harry Truman, into a difficult spot. They had to figure out when to utilize the US military might to check the advance of communism. The first test came in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, attempting to take over the whole peninsula. The United States did not stay on the sidelines, instead sending in military forces, which, although they were pushed back from their drive on the Yalu River, they did succeed in preserving South Korea. Thus, the Truman Doctrine was born, which established that the United States would provide political, military, and economic aid to democratic nations under threat from communist forces. This policy of containment aimed to stop Soviet expansionism, marking a major shift towards US interventionism. The United States, looking to aggressively confront communism before it could spread into the developing world, would ultimately pull the country into the Vietnam War. The experience in Vietnam would traumatize the American nation, in both societal and military terms. However, Southeast Asia was not the only area the US looked to check the spread of Soviet influence. The Middle East was a key region during the Cold War. The Middle East mattered greatly in the Cold War because of the counter to Soviet-styled communism that the United States presented: free trade capitalism, or in other words, what came to be known as globalization. At the end of World War II, the United States was looking to create an alternative to communism. In their system, developing countries could be lured by the prospect of massive economic expansion. This is how countries like South Korea could go from largely agrarian and underdeveloped into massively industrialized and highly technological. Industrialization had boomed in the 1800s, leading to countries like Great Britain, the United States, and Germany to grow wealthy. However, industrialization has always been difficult for smaller countries, or resource-lacking ones, like Japan, for example. Sure, they could industrialize, but there was a hard ceiling on that capacity. The only way to break the hard cap was by aggressively invading neighbors to take their resources. Those resources could then be used to feed your growing industrialization. As well, those colonies could be used as markets for your own domestically manufactured products, which would help your GDP grow. Pursuit of resources and colonial markets had led to the age of imperialism in the late 1800s. That competition for colonies helped foster the environment which led to World War I. Even after the Great War, competition for possession of key strategic ground would continue. Pursuit of resources to grow stronger is what led Japan to expand throughout Asia, like in Manchuria, a region they needed for its food production in order to feed Japan's growing industrial base. Eventually, Japan would attack the United States, bringing the US into World War II. Japan attacked the US because they needed access to the oil in the East Indies. Small nations like South Korea, meanwhile, never had the military capability to try and seize resources by might alone, and so they were left to be primarily agrarian societies. Small states like that had to be agrarian because access to food is critical to a state's existence. Even if you had the natural resources to industrially expand, if a country does not have access to a surplus of food, the population will be unable to exploit said resources. At the end of World War II, the United States anticipated this problem. In a conference called Bretton Woods in 1944, the US brought together 44 allied nations at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The goal would be to regulate what would be the international monetary and financial order after the end of World War II. The system would be one focused on free trade and economic opportunities underwritten by the protection provided by the US military. This is where globalization comes in. In order for the developing world to industrialize and become a part of a growing capitalistic free trade world, they would need steady access to two things: food and fuel. The United States Navy would be critical here, because it would be used to provide security for all global trade. That is how farmers in North America could have their crops and cattle sent to nations like Korea or Japan, who could then use that steady access to food to grow their urban industrial base, and in turn, grow their economies. However, they would need more than just food. Like I said, they would need fuel to power this industrialization. North and South American oil alone would not be enough to power a globalized world. That is where the Middle East comes into play. Stable access to that region's rich oil reserves could be used to power the economic expansion of a free trade world. That is essentially the simplified explanation of how nations, which in the past had no strong links, became dependent upon one another. If you want an interesting and easy read that explains globalization, try reading Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I do recommend it. Since the United States was the leading globalization power, they had a strong incentive to keep communism out of the Middle East and create alliances with the leading Arab powers. In the post-World War II era, finding alliances in the Middle East would be tricky. That was because of the Arab-Israeli wars, starting in the 1940s and continuing to flare up in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, even with those wars destabilizing relations in the region, the United States was able to firm up two strong partnerships in the region: Iran and Saudi Arabia. The CIA in 1953 had actually aided a coup in Iran to give the Shah, who was pro-Western, more power and control. However, the United States would then lose Iran as a vital ally in 1979, when Khomeini in the Iranian Revolution ousted the Shah. That revolution turned Iran from vital ally into mortal enemy. The US would try to mitigate the loss of Iran as an ally by aligning with Saddam's Iraq in the 1980s. The United States also had a vested interest in preventing the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, and so the Reagan administration would provide invaluable intelligence to the Iraqi military throughout the war with Iran. However, Saddam never fully trusted the US, feeling they were still his enemy because of their support for Israel. Then the Iran-Contra scandal broke, in which Reagan administration officials secretly sold arms to Iran in order to secure the release of hostages in Lebanon. Proceeds from these sales were then illegally funneled to the Contras, a Nicaraguan rebel group. When the story broke, Saddam saw it as US trickery, trying to aid both Iran and Iraq with the goal of wearing each of the states down in a war of attrition for the ultimate benefit of Israel. Saddam's relationship with the United States in the 80s did not end after Iran-Contra though, but after his invasion of Kuwait, the US would fully cut off diplomatic relations with Saddam's Iraq. Even with the loss of Iran as an ally to the United States, they still had Saudi Arabia, who was also dedicated to keeping communism out of the Middle East. Keeping communism out of the Middle East is one of the major reasons the United States, along with Saudi Arabia, aided the Mujahideen fighters after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. By 1990, the Cold War may have been nearing its end, with the Soviet Union embroiled in turmoil, but that did not diminish the importance of the Middle East, and in many ways actually increased the region's importance. The fall of the Iron Curtain meant that a whole new world order was approaching, with one lone superpower, the United States, leading the way. As well, it meant that many more nations would be joining the globalized world. Those new nations in the globalized order would require steady access to fuel from the Middle East. That is the context you should keep in mind when reviewing Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, and that in consequence, the US-led response to that aggression. President George Bush Sr. had talked eloquently about a new world order, tied together by trade. How could he then let Saddam take advantage of the changing world to use naked aggression in order to enhance his own power and resources? Bush and the other Western leaders feared that Saddam's expansionist tendencies would lead him to strike at Saudi Arabia next. Saddam had the fourth largest military in the world by 1990, and it was battle-hardened after almost a decade-long conflict with Iran. Sure, it was not the most sophisticated force, but neither was Saudi Arabia's. If Saddam launched an invasion of Saudi Arabia next, it was likely that the Iraqi forces would overwhelm them. In fact, all Saddam really needed to do was seize the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Taking that would give him full control of roughly 40 to 50% of the world's oil production. Intervention was not a straightforward decision though. In many ways, the ghosts of Vietnam were still lurking. Americans were terrified of getting involved into another quagmire. As well, the Vietnam War had broken the US military's confidence. However, since that very low point, the US military had steadily regained its confidence, successfully executing operations in Grenada and Panama. Iraq was seen as a whole different beast though. Saddam's army was battle-hardened, equipped with Soviet tech, and they had been digging into defensive positions since the invasion of Kuwait. Fear of another Vietnam may have been on the president's mind, but there were other historic influences at play. President Bush had grown up in the era where the folly of Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler was seen as a colossal diplomatic mistake. Bush refused to do the same. This type of naked aggression needed to be checked. Bush wanted to set the right tone for the New World Order. On August 6th, he signed the order to deploy 122 F-15s and 16s to the Middle East. This was just the beginning though, as the US Navy brought its carrier force into the region, which helped to facilitate the steady influx of men and material into Saudi Arabia, into blocking positions in what was named Operation Desert Shield. What ultimately came next would be called the Gulf War, where a US-led coalition force of over 40 nations confronted Saddam's Iraq. With Bush and the UN's decision to intervene, Saddam was presented with a monumental task: how to hold out against the combined might of the coalition forces. Saddam had planned to win this war like he won his previous war against Iran, by winning a war of attrition. In the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam's forces had success by sitting on the defensive and digging into fortifications to await the Iranian assaults. Saddam wanted to repeat this strategy by digging his forces into positions on the Saudi Arabian border. From there, they would await the coalition assault. Saddam envisioned a World War I-style war of attrition. A war of attrition he felt the United States did not have the stomach for. Once the US started to experience casualties, he felt their home front population would then turn on the war and sue for peace. like what had happened in Vietnam. Saddam was not a military genius, and had wildly discounted the difference between Iran's low-tech, human-wave-based military and the advanced-tech, highly professional coalition militaries led by the United States. On January 16, 1991, Saddam would find out that he was in for a rude awakening. On that date, the coalition air campaign began. The UN deadline for the Iraqi forces to leave Kuwait had passed, and so targets throughout Kuwait and Iraq were pounded from above. In only a week's time, the coalition would gain complete air supremacy. Not just air superiority, but complete air supremacy. The difference is that air superiority simply means the ability of your air forces to operate with only limited interference from the enemy, while air supremacy means the enemy is incapable of interference against air operations. The coalition forces would strike where they wanted, when they wanted, without significant threat. The Iraqi Air Force was so overwhelmed that Saddam actually had them fly to Iran to wait out the conflict. Saddam's hope was that by hiding his fighters in Iran, it would prevent their destruction, and then he could get his fighters back after the war ended. Saddam had weirdly discounted the fact that Iran hated him after having just ended a decade-long war with Iraq just 2 years prior, and so after the Gulf War, Iran simply kept the fighters. After 5 weeks of bombing, the land component of Operation Desert Storm began. On February 24, 1991, the land assault began with 3 U.S. divisions crossing the Saudi Arabian border into Kuwait. Arab, British, French, and other nations' forces were also involved in the offensive. Saddam had promised the mother of all battles would take place. However, he was deeply wrong. Iraqi resistance immediately fell apart after the ground offensive began. The pounding from the air had taken its toll on them. In only 2 days' time, the coalition army had liberated the Kuwaiti capital, and only 2 more days after that, the ground offensive was complete. It was an emphatic success. The ground offensive to liberate Kuwait lasted from February 24th until February 28th, exceeding the expectations of even the most optimistic planners. When the United States decided to intervene in the Middle East for the Gulf War, the Bush administration had 3 war goals that would determine victory. Number 1, liberate Kuwait. That clearly was achieved. Number 2, destroy the Iraqi Republican Guard as an offensive force in the region. That was also accomplished, as Iraqi air, armor, and artillery were obliterated, and no longer a threat to invade other nations in the region. And number 3, create the conditions for the overthrow of Saddam. This was done by destroying Saddam's army in the field, and by making conditions at home for everyday Iraqis so deplorable that they would rise up to overthrow Saddam for having brought the nation to this point. In the air campaign, the coalition forces destroyed airfields, oil refineries, power stations, bridges, and communication targets, which essentially brought Iraq back to the Stone Age. It seemed like that third goal had been set in motion. Bush's administration hoped a military coup would handle the final push to overthrow Saddam. What the Bush administration did not want to do was directly intervene into the overthrow of Saddam. 2 of Bush's closest advisors throughout the Gulf conflict were his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Both of them agreed with Bush's decision to end the Gulf War without invading directly into Iraq in order to overthrow Saddam. The end of the Gulf War would not lead to a clean solution to the Saddam problem, as we will see in the next chapter. In March of 1991, Sultan Hashim of Iraq met with U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf to finalize the military ceasefire to end the war. This would begin a chaotic decade from 1991 until 1998 in Iraq, highlighted by UN inspections, rebellions, coup attempts, and low-level warfare. During Hashim and Schwarzkopf's meeting, most of the issues were straightforward, like prisoner exchanges. However, the Iraqis had one interesting request. Fixed-wing aircraft were not allowed to be used by the Iraqi Air Force, but they asked Schwarzkopf if they could use helicopters. Schwarzkopf accepted the use of helicopters. They would be required to stay away from the ceasefire front line, however they could carry armaments, which would have devastating consequences for the people of Iraq. During the Gulf War, the Bush administration hoped to create the conditions for a coup or rebellion which would overthrow Saddam. In the aftermath of the war, that is exactly what happened, starting with the restless Shia population in Basra. They broke out into a serious rebellion in the spring of 1991. Saddam, in response to this threat to his regime, once again utilized brutal measures. Chemical Ali was dispatched with the Republican Guard to bring the region under heel. Led by the Republican Guard, Saddam's forces crushed the rebellion, utilizing tanks, artillery, and attack helicopters to pulverize full cities and purge them of dissidents. The Shias in the south had thought that assistance would come from outside of Iraq, but the Bush administration decided against direct intervention into this rebellion. His military leaders worried about coordinating with a leaderless rebellion, which is what the Basra uprising was. As well, the Bush administration was concerned about supporting a Shia revolt which had strong ties to the Iranian government. What Bush and his cabinet preferred was a military-led coup with a new strongman replacing Saddam. A strongman who wasn't as expansionist and could be worked with. Basically a magic bullet replacement. Nation building was to be avoided at all costs. The South was not the only region to rebel. The Kurdish North rebelled once again. The end of the Gulf War saw the greatest threat to Saddam's regime in 20 years. It is estimated that his forces had lost control of all but 4 of Iraq's provinces. Once southern Iraq was quelled, Saddam's forces shifted north to focus on the Kurds. Once again, Saddam brutally crushed the Kurds. This time, though, the Bush administration did intervene, however not fully directly. Operation Provide Comfort was launched in April of 1991. The main actions in this operation were to deliver aid to the Kurdish populations and create a no-fly zone, which helped to create a semi-autonomous Kurdistan region. After these rebellions is when the CIA became tasked with looking into developing a coup against Saddam. However, the CIA operation would never receive much strong backing from Bush or Clinton's administrations. The end of the Gulf War also meant 2 more major developments for Iraq. Number 1, they would be forced to allow UN inspectors to oversee the dismantling of Iraq's biological and chemical weapons and facilities. And number 2, Iraq would be under economic sanctions until they complied with the UN inspections. The sanctions were brutal for Iraq's ability to recover after the war, since their economy was fully tied to the export of oil. The UN Resolution 687 began on April 3, 1991. This would begin Saddam's long battle with UN inspectors. You see, Saddam initially intended to lie in order to save as much of his arsenal as possible, fooling the inspectors wherever he could. The leader of Saddam's nuclear program, Jafar, knew this would be an impossible task, since their nuclear efforts had grown so large that concealment would be impossible. But he tried his best anyway, because in Saddam's Iraq, you do not question an order. In May of 1991, the first team of UN inspectors arrived, and were determined to investigate Iraq's nuclear program near Baghdad. Hussein Kamel, who was Saddam's son-in-law and point person for the nuclear program, used security forces to block, menace, tail, and harass the UN inspectors at every turn. It didn't work, though. By June, the Iraqi attempts to hide the extent of their nuclear program had failed. The world now knew just how much investment Saddam had made into making a nuclear weapon. Saddam's pursuit of a nuclear weapon began all the way back in the late 70s, when he had purchased a French reactor. That reactor, he pretended, was meant for peaceful power means, but in reality, the fuel in the research reactors the French planned to install would be highly enriched uranium, which was potent enough that if one day Saddam decided to misuse the material to make a bomb, he could. Saddam's mortal enemy, Israel, got wind of his designs on a nuclear weapon, and on June 7, 1981, while Iraq was at war with Iran, Israeli jets executed Operation Opera, bombing and dealing critical damage to the reactors. This humiliated and infuriated Saddam. To him, any weapon that Israel possessed should also be possessed by the Arab world. Saddam would continue his quest to develop a nuclear weapon throughout the 1980s. His scientists would have to get creative and find a way to test and research a nuclear weapon without the world finding out. This is where Saddam could be pragmatic. He wanted a nuclear weapon to deter Israel and reach parity with them in the region. However, he did not want to risk escalating world powers against him. The CIA, meanwhile, discounted the Iraqi nation's ability to generate a nuke. They felt that Iraq would require outside help to complete one, and there was no way they could do it alone. Iraqi scientists did get creative though. They avoided a plutonium bomb, since that would be detected by satellite recon, and instead focused on uranium. To enrich uranium, building centrifuges was out of the question, since that would require purchasing materials which would surely be detected by the international community. Pakistan had created their bomb by using centrifuges, and that had been detected by international governments. Saddam in the mid-80s was still fighting his war with Iran, and so he did not want to risk being an international pariah. Jafar and his scientists ultimately settled on the same method the Manhattan Project scientists had employed to enrich uranium fuel to create a weapon. Once the Gulf War broke out, Saddam got desperate and pushed his scientists to create a bomb by February of 1991. Saddam hoped his possession of a nuclear bomb would deter the coalition from launching its offensive. Jafar's scientists did make solid progress, but by the time of Desert Storm, they still didn't have a usable bomb. Although Iraq still was some time away from a usable bomb, the progress of Iraq's nuclear program nonetheless shocked the international community when it was discovered. It was estimated that Iraq probably could have built a bomb by the end of the 1990s had their scientists been left to continue their work. This is when Bush Sr. determined that Saddam was too dangerous to be allowed back into the international community. If left unchecked, Saddam was almost guaranteed to try once again to develop deadly weapons. From here, the Bush administration pushed the inspections and sanctions to create such conditions that will lead Saddam to be removed from power. Saddam's nuclear program was not the only weapon the UN inspectors were concerned with. During Saddam's reign, his scientists had developed a deadly array of biological and chemical weapons. In order to make sure Saddam was no longer the threat that he had been in the Middle East, those weapons and the facilities to create such weapons would have to be dismantled. Saddam deeply relied on those weapons for prestige and for the security of his power. Saddam, as a dictator, relied on fear and the projection of power, both internally and externally. For internal purposes, he had used chemical weapons to brutally put down threats to his regime like the Kurdish rebellions. After the Kurds suffered severe gas attacks, that sent a message to any dissident groups in Iraq that they too ran the risk of similar reprisals if they stepped out of line. Fear of being gassed kept Saddam's population from attempting to overthrow his regime. WMDs like biological and chemical weapons also served as a deterrent against external threats like Iran. If they tried to attack Iraq again, Saddam could use this arsenal like he had during their war in the 80s. Iran wasn't the main threat that plagued Saddam's mindset. The biggest threat to him was Israel. Israel had a much more advanced army and air force than Saddam did. Plus, they had nuclear weapon capabilities, which Saddam did not. That deeply bothered the Iraqi dictator, because as long as Israel had a nuke, and he didn't, the balance of power would forever be in Israel's favor. They could wipe his regime off the map at any moment, while he had no equivalent response. Except for biological and chemical weapons, that is. Saddam had his scientists work to develop ways to hit Israel with their chemical weapons arsenal. In Saddam's attempt to achieve parity with Israel, or at least some form of deterrence against an Israeli strike, his greatest challenge was to find a way to plausibly threaten Tel Aviv, which lay 570 miles from Baghdad. Iraq's Mirage fighter jets were no match for Israeli air defenses. Saddam had acquired heavy Soviet Scud ballistic missiles during his war with Iran. His son-in-law Kamel oversaw modifications that extended those missiles' range, allowing them to reach Israel if they were fired from Iraq's western deserts. In the spring of 1990, Saddam ordered a test firing of one of those long-range Scuds with a chemical agent in the warhead, an experiment that went undetected by the CIA and all other Western intelligence agencies at the time. Yet, Scuds were difficult to aim, and harder still to successfully equip with chemical weapons. The intense heat created by the warhead's explosive impact tended to incinerate a chemical payload before it could be dispersed. Firing a Scud missile equipped only with conventional explosives would be like throwing an expensive bomb at Israel. Unnerving and deadly, but not a threat likely to deter Tel Aviv from attacking Iraq. To explore another option, starting in 1988, Saddam had constructed a giant experimental artillery gun. He called the project Babylon. Saddam invested $25 million to hire Bull, a Canadian rocket scientist, to create an Iraqi weapon that might fire chemical shells onto Israel. These shells would disperse poison gas lethally, just like Iraqi artillery shells had done during their war with Iran. This work went far enough and seemed plausible enough that Mossad sent warnings to Bull, informing him of what would happen if he didn't abandon Project Babylon. Bull persisted though. His team initiated construction of the world's largest ever artillery gun, fitted with a steel barrel 170 yards long. Israel made good on its threat though. In March of 1990, Bull met his end, after Mossad agents assassinated him in Brussels. To Saddam, this was another aggravating loss to Israel during their shadow war. By the time of the Gulf War, Saddam would have 230 Scud missiles, of which 75 had been loaded with chemical weapons capabilities. He ultimately would not use these special warheads in the Gulf War, but he did use normal Scud missiles to strike at Israel. The ultimate goal for Saddam had been to use biological and chemical weapons to strike at Israel if they ever used a nuke against Iraq. The Israeli nuke power dynamic scales could be balanced by Israel having to face being overwhelmed by Iraqi biological and chemical weapons, which would do horrifying damage to their population. If the UN inspectors dismantled Saddam's biological and chemical weapons capacity, then Saddam will no longer be able to deter threats both internally and externally, which could lead to his regime's collapse. That is why Saddam instructed his scientists and officials to obstruct the UN inspectors and to lie. He wanted to keep as much as he could of the biological and chemical weapons. However, just like Iraq's hectic attempts to cover up their nuclear program, the biological and chemical weapon cover-up went equally poorly. The UN inspectors quickly saw through the Iraqi lies. Saddam then changed course. He became worried that their evasions and cover-ups could lead to continued sanctions, or ultimately could lead the UN to depose him. In a complete reversal, Saddam instructed his scientists to destroy all the biological and chemical weapons and facilities. Saddam was hoping by destroying these weapons, their original lie of not having WMDs could then become true. In the summer of 1991, Kamel ordered the rapid destruction of all clandestine nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons facilities, before the UN could confirm their true purpose. Iraqi scientists destroyed about 1,000 ready-to-use chemical bombs, as well as 20 concealed chemical warheads built for missiles that could strike at Israel. Other teams destroyed about 200 tons of VX nerve agents, 10 tons of mustard precursor, and more than a ton of damaged VX agent. When the frenzy work was completed, Aziz could credibly say that Iraq had no chemical weapons. But the world had no reason to believe this, since it was done in secret, and because the destruction had been carried out without record keeping, photography, or other forms of proof. Iraq had no means to show pervasively what it had done, should they choose to come clean. Basically, when the Iraqi officials met with the UN inspectors after the biological and chemical weapons were destroyed, they could not adequately account for everything that was destroyed, since no record existed. That made UN inspectors doubt that the Iraqis had actually destroyed everything, and it would taint their future interactions. What also hurt the Iraqi scientists' case even more was that they did not even admit to lying about their historic arsenal, and they didn't even admit to destroying the biological, chemical, and nuclear facilities until March of 1992, almost a full year later. The UN officials would believe throughout the inspections that because the Iraqis had lied and evaded so much at the beginning, that the regime could not be trusted, and that they were always lying, even when Iraq did eventually become more forthcoming. Bush Sr. would no longer be dealing with Saddam, though. He lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton, and so now Saddam was Clinton's problem. By the time Clinton took office in 1993, a second no-fly zone had been instituted over Iraq. This one was meant to protect the southern population of Iraq, the Shias. Clinton reviewed the Bush policy for Saddam and saw no reason to break from it or alter it. What the United States wanted in the Middle East more than anything was stability. Throughout the last 50 years, the main flare-ups in this region had been between Israel and other Arab states. By the 1990s, though, most of the states in the Middle East had accepted that Israel was a fact of life. They may not like it, but they weren't going to try actively fighting against it. One of the major exceptions was Saddam's Iraq. From the time he took power in 1979 until Clinton took office in 1993, 11 out of a total of those 15 years, Saddam's Iraq had actively been involved in a war. As well, both wars during that time frame were initiated by an aggressive move by Saddam. With Iran, Saddam had invaded in 1980, and with Kuwait, he had invaded in 1990. Saddam was seen as aggressively militaristic and devoted to expansion. That is why US foreign policy towards Iraq in the mid-1990s viewed him as a major threat to stability. He was not one who could be worked with or reformed. Saddam, if left alone, would eventually try to rearm and expand. However, there was no interest at this time for direct involvement in toppling Saddam. After all, the dictator had no way to directly threaten the United States or its citizens. Containment would be used instead, keeping Saddam bottled up with sanctions, which would prevent him from reacquiring strength. Basically, the sanctions would stay in place until Saddam was gone. Clinton would show Saddam early on how forceful he could be after a failed assassination attempt of Bush Sr. during a visit to Kuwait. That plot had ties to the Iraqi government, and so Clinton, in response, authorized airstrikes on Baghdad. Clinton would again authorize airstrikes against Iraq in 1998, which bombed over 100 targets. Saddam and his Iraqi army would reply to those strikes by increasing tensions around the no-fly zones. Iraqi anti-air weapons would regularly harass UN fighters around the no-fly zones. Between 1991 and 2003, it was essentially a low-level war. During the 1990s, after a decade and a half of war and sanctions, the quality of life in Iraq took a nosedive. The size of Iraq's economy had shrunk from $180 billion in 1990 all the way down to about $13 billion by the end of 1995. This economic catastrophe, combined with war destruction, led to a collapse of basic necessities within the country. The destruction of Iraq's electrical power systems during the Gulf War degraded the country's water purification plants, contributing to the revival of previously vanquished diseases. Iraq had no recorded cholera cases in 1989, but by 1994 it had over 1,300 cases per 1,000 people. The prevalence of typhoid grew by more than tenfold. As well, nearly a third of children under 5 suffered from malnutrition, while clean water and medical supplies were grossly inadequate. Rates of infant mortality rose from 25 deaths per 1,000 to 93 per 1,000. Surgeries in Iraqi hospitals fell by 2/3 during this same period, due to a lack of anesthetic supplies and medical equipment, as well as a clear shortage of hospitals and health centers. These sudden reversals of national health devastated all Iraqis, but hit the urban middle classes especially hard, since they had further to fall after Iraq's industrialization drives during the 1970s. There was a nationwide rise in murder, kidnapping, forgery, divorce, unemployment, and children begging on the streets. In economic terms, per capita Iraqi incomes had fallen from about $4,200 in 1979 to just $485 in 1993. The plight of the Iraqi people led to the Food for Oil program. Starting in late 1995, Iraq would be allowed to sell up to $4 billion worth of oil a year. 2/3 of those profits would then be used to purchase needed food, medicine, and other supplies, while the last 1/3 would be used to pay back Kuwait for the damage Saddam's invasion had done. Iraqi forces had done significant damage to the state, most notably during the retreat, when the Iraqi army set fire to oil pumps en masse. Saddam had originally not wanted to accept the Food for Oil program. He was too prideful to accept aid from the UN. As well, he had propagandized the hardships caused by sanctions to try and erode support for those sanctions. However, eventually Saddam did come around, but not for humanitarian purposes. Instead, he used the program, in which he had complete control over which companies could receive Iraqi crude, to enrich himself and his cronies at the expense of the Iraqi people. Saddam and his cronies were making up to $2 billion a year in illicit trade like this. Saddam would primarily sell his crude to France, Russia, and China, attempting to buy those states' influence at the UN to end the sanctions. UN inspections, rebellions, airstrikes, and a crumbling economy were not the only problems facing Saddam in this era. He also faced coups. His son-in-law Kemal would actually defect in 1995. Kemal had overseen the Iraqi nuclear program and was very close to Saddam. This betrayal enraged him and deepened the dictator's paranoia. Then in 1996, a semi-CIA-backed coup was discovered by Saddam. I say semi because Clinton never gave this operation the full green light to go ahead to launch. Saddam's security forces discovered the dissident network and brutally snuffed it out. Then later, Saddam's son Uday was a target in an assassination plot, when gunmen fired on him while he was driving his Porsche through Baghdad. Saddam surviving multiple internal threats to his regime throughout the 90s fed his paranoia to astronomical levels. He avoided public appearances and constantly changed palaces in order to avoid perceived assassination attempts. Through all of this chaos, the UN inspectors kept about their work dismantling Saddam's WMDs. They were quite successful, in fact. More successful than they even realized. In 1995, Iraq's missile arsenal had been dismantled, while by 1997, inspectors felt confident, but not 100% certain, that Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs were eliminated. They could not be certain, because during the dismantling of missiles and the WMD programs, Iraqi officials continued to lie. Aziz, the deputy prime minister of Iraq, had led these evasions. Throughout the inspections, Aziz, under Saddam's orders, attempted to hide secrets about past chemical weapon use as well as their nuclear program. Another secret that Saddam wanted to stay hidden was that by the eve of the Gulf War, they had loaded germ agents into about 166 bombs and 25 missile warheads. Those weapons had been destroyed, but no record existed of everything they destroyed. And so Aziz looked to prevent the UN inspectors, led by Rolf Ekus, from discovering this biological weapon program. When 1998 began, the Clinton administration was in turmoil. The Monica Lewinsky scandal had just broken. Saddam saw the fragility in the US domestic situation and decided to capitalize on it. He had come to the conclusion that the sanctions were never going to be lifted as long as he was in power, and so he felt it didn't make sense to continue to abide by the UN inspections if it wasn't ultimately going to lead to the release of the sanctions. That is why in December of 1998, he kicked out the UN inspectors, vowing to never let them return. there would be no more inspections for another 4 years. Saddam's ending of the UN inspections is actually what caused Clinton to order Operation Desert Fox to strike at Iraqi targets. During the strikes, only 13 of the over 100 targets hit were believed to be involved in Iraq's WMD programs. Half were regime leadership or military sites. The real target for the strikes was Saddam and his grip on power. Going forward, the US approach to Iraq would be to maintain containment of Saddam. However, with the inspectors gone, Iraq would become a black hole of information between 1998 and 2002. Lack of reliable information from within the country wasn't a problem when the policy approach favored containment. But in 2001, the world changed. And with it, the United States policy in the Middle East. As the new century dawned, the United States had a new president, George Bush Jr. Bush had won a very contentious election that had gone all the way to the Supreme Court. Once in office, the Saddam problem was not among his priorities. Bush ran primarily on major tax cuts, education reform, and restructuring of Social Security. While in foreign policy, Bush had consistently hammered his opponent, Al Gore, for Bill Clinton's nation-building attempts, like in Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans. Gore had been Clinton's vice president. Bush did not have much knowledge or interest in foreign issues, and that is why he filled out his cabinet to make up for this shortcoming. Bush delegated enormous power to his vice president, Dick Cheney, who had been his dad's Secretary of Defense, and handled a lot of the diplomacy with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern states during the Gulf War. For Secretary of State, Bush had selected Colin Powell, who had an astonishing 83% Gallup approval rating. Powell had gained immense prestige during his time in the Reagan administration and as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Gulf War. Powell's doctrine in warfare emphasized the need for the United States to have clear and achievable goals in war. And once engaged, he wanted the force sent to be massive and overwhelming. Bush and Powell's relationship could be tense, as Bush viewed the beloved Powell as a possible threat in a future election. Then for Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld was put in charge. Rumsfeld had been an ambassador to NATO and a special envoy to the Middle East. Rumsfeld had actually met with Saddam in the 80s to help build relations between the two countries. Then finally in the foreign policy realm was Bush's national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. She would be tasked with mediating any disagreements in foreign policy. When this administration took office, Bush's team had to figure out what to do with their Saddam problem. Powell and Rice favored containment. Powell had stated that they had the bad guy in a box, and they should keep building the box. Cheney, for his part, had contempt for Saddam, but understood Bush's lack of interest in adventurism, and so he was against any direct movement on Saddam. Rumsfeld would present Bush with 3 different options on how to handle Saddam. First, the US could roll up its tents and end the no-fly zones before someone is killed or captured. Then the administration could figure out a way to keep an eye on Saddam Hussein's aggressiveness against his neighbors from a distance. Rumsfeld argued indirectly against this option, asserting that within a few years, the US would undoubtedly have to confront a Saddam armed with a nuclear weapon. Another option was to approach their Arab friends and see if they would be willing to engage in a more robust policy. He noted that the risks of a serious regime change policy had to be weighed against the danger of an increasingly bold and nuclear-armed Saddam in the near future. Finally, Rumsfeld laid out a third possibility, one that obviously intrigued him. They could talk to Saddam. Rumsfeld stated, "He has his own interests. It may be that, for whatever reason, at this stage in his life, he might prefer to not have the hostility of the United States and the West, and might be willing to make some accommodation." Rumsfeld admitted that such an initiative would be an astonishing departure for the US. It would win praise from certain quarters, but might cause friends, especially those in the region, to question the administration's strength. Bush would decide to keep the status quo, endorsing sanctions intended to restrict Iraq's access to materials which could be used to make a WMD, and continued the no-fly zones. The no-fly zones made Bush uneasy, though. He was worried they could end up sparking a war. Saddam was a problem that needed a policy. However, the problem the Bush administration did not see as a high or even a mid-level priority was the rise of global terrorism. That would change quickly. On September 11, 2001, 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 planes for a suicide mission, crashing them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and in a field in Pennsylvania. In total, roughly 3,000 people lost their lives in the attacks, making it the deadliest terror attack in history. This event was stunning for a multitude of reasons, but especially so for the American people. The average person in the United States rarely, if ever, encountered the effects of terrorism before that day. The country had not even seen a major attack on the homeland from an external force since the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. However, that attack could make logical sense, since it was intended to cripple the US Navy in the Pacific. The 9/11 attacks primarily affected everyday citizens, and were designed to do as much death and destruction to as many innocent people as possible. To say 9/11 changed everything is not an understatement, but it is especially true at the highest levels of the American government. The shock of the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks altered how the American government viewed threats. Before 9/11, US leadership felt safe from major threats due to 2 large oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, separating North and South America from the rest of the world. During the Cold War era, the greatest threat was nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and so warning systems had been created to prevent America from being hit by an external surprise attack. Mutually assured destruction ultimately prevented a major nuclear war from happening. Once the Cold War ended and tensions with Russia eased, it seemed as though no major threat could possibly reach the homeland. Then 9/11 happened, opening up whole new possibilities about future threats. Possibilities that would have been inconceivable only months before. What made matters more complicated was that the US was not attacked by another state, like in Pearl Harbor, but instead a terrorist organization, which was a stateless entity relying on small independent cells to carry out attacks. This made global terrorism all the more scary, because you could never know when or where the next attack could come from. The fear of preventing the next 9/11 would be ever present on the Bush administration's mindset moving forward. Men like Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld vowed to never be caught sleeping again. From now on, they would be proactive rather than reactive when fighting threats to the country. The beginning of the War on Terror would bring a change in how the Bush administration viewed geopolitics. Containment had become unacceptable. If a threat existed, it must be extinguished. That's how the logic went. That is where Saddam comes in. The bad man was in a box. However, fear of that bad man aiding terror organizations would ultimately be one of the biggest drivers for the Bush administration towards war with Iraq. Next, let's cover the timeline to war. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, initially there was very little talk of Saddam as a major threat, except for one man, who from the early hours after the attacks felt Saddam must be involved. That man was Paul Wolfowitz. You may not know this man's name, because he's not always front and center as other figures in the Iraq War tragedy story, but he may have been the most die-hard for the cause of removing Saddam. Wolfowitz had become obsessed with eliminating Saddam as a regional and global threat as early as 1991. At first, Bush and the others of his administration had no real interest in Wolfowitz's Saddam project. In fact, in the days after 9/11, Wolfowitz had tried to convince Bush to go after Saddam for the attacks, and was angrily rebuked by Bush. Over the course of fall 2001, Bush and his top advisors would change their tune on Saddam and the threat he possessed. Saddam was an expansionist dictator with an affinity for developing and using biological and chemical weapons. Saddam had even pursued a nuclear weapon. In the pre-9/11 geopolitical landscape, that wasn't a huge deal, since Saddam had no way to use a WMD against the United States. However, in a post-9/11 world, the threat and ability of terrorists felt all-powerful. Terrorists were dedicated to the mission of hitting the American homeland, and the September 11th attacks felt like just the beginning. These terror cells would continue to develop new strategies and tactics to reach the United States. What if they came in possession of a truly destructive weapon? If a terror cell could obtain a WMD, the damage they could inflict would be catastrophic. That fear was top of mind for Bush and his administration. Their thinking gravitated towards 9/11 may have been awful, but it could have been significantly worse. That was something that was a back burner fear in the past. Clinton had worried about terrorists gaining a WMD back when he was in office. The Tokyo terror attacks had terrified him into the realities of what biological weapons could do. That attack was orchestrated by a Japanese cult which released sarin gas on the metro, killing a dozen people and injuring hundreds more. But what rogue state was most likely to be the facilitator of a WMD to a terror group? Saddam's Iraqi regime would start to be linked as the most likely regime to aid terrorist efforts to get a WMD. Saddam despised the United States and had shown the ability to develop WMDs in the past, with no moral concerns about using these weapons even on civilians. Saddam had also promised monetary rewards for Palestinian suicide bombers, and had given provocative anti-American speeches right after the 9/11 attacks. To Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, among others, it seemed highly plausible and even likely that if left unchecked, Saddam would partner with Islamic terrorists. It may seem highly dramatic to think in these terms, but these felt like dramatic times. The United States had discounted the unthinkable before, and that had left 3,000 people dead. Never again would the unthinkable be discounted. However, the immediate timeline of the US invasion of Iraq does not really begin until December of 2001. By that time, Afghanistan had been swiftly taken over by US forces, and so what the next move in the war on terror should be was being discussed. Bush had toyed with the idea of Saddam's involvement in 9/11, even with no evidence, starting in the fall of 2001. By December, he felt the next step in the war on terror should be eliminating likely state sponsors of terror. Iraq was on the top of his list. In January of 2002, Bush would make his first public attempt to start selling the American people on the threat posed by Saddam. In his State of the Union address, he infamously labeled Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the new axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
In this speech, Bush argued for the extension of the war on terror. This speech would start a theme of rhetoric from his administration to prepare the American people behind the case for war with Iraq in order to remove Saddam from power. The ultimate irony of Bush's axis of evil speech was that the two other powers listed, Iran and North Korea, by definition were bigger threats than Iraq. Iran was a significant state sponsor of terrorism, while North Korea was on a quest for a nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, Iraq had never meaningfully worked with terror groups. It had given up its quest for a nuke. Now that Bush put Iraq firmly in the bullseye, it would be up to men like Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Tenet of the CIA to gather evidence and justification to convince the American people that Saddam was a threat if left unchecked. The evidence they relied on would be riddled with flaws. And that is what we'll cover now. Now, what actual evidence, or supposed evidence, did the Bush administration use to justify their invasion of Iraq? Let's go through the main ones here, to see how well they stand up to scrutiny. First, and one of the most important things the Bush administration needed to do was link Saddam's regime to the broader war on terror. To do that, they would need to find a concrete connection between Saddam and bin Laden. The first such possibility of a link came after the invasion of Afghanistan. The CIA discovered that bin Laden had been in pursuit of advanced biological, chemical, and even nuclear weapons. With that evidence, the follow-up question could be used to point towards Saddam as the most likely rogue actor to give Al-Qaeda a WMD. Saddam was a devoted enemy of the United States, so that would make sense, right? The problem was that bin Laden and Saddam were not compatible partners. Sure, they both hated America, but bin Laden also hated Saddam. Saddam was a secular Arab leader, which bin Laden constantly denounced as illegitimate. Bin Laden wanted Islamic theocracies in the Middle East, while Saddam was hyper-paranoid. He barely even trusted his own family. And so then why would he trust bin Laden, who had called for his overthrow and was trying to foster the same type of Islam that would undermine Saddam's largely godless regime? Seems like a problem, right? Well, Bush and his administration didn't see it as much of an issue. They felt bin Laden's denouncements of Saddam would be overcome by the shared enemy theory. Like how in World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union allied together, even though the two powers were ideologically at odds. The threat of Nazi Germany overcame ideology, and so the same could hold true in this situation. The Bush administration and the intelligence agencies did try to gather some concrete connections between bin Laden and Saddam. 6 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, Czech authorities uncovered from an informant that an Iraqi diplomat had met with hijacker Muhammad Atta in April of 2001. This seemed like a concrete link between Iraq and the pre-9/11 planning. Well, not entirely. There were several reasons to doubt this report. First, it relied on a single, unnamed informant who was shown a newspaper photo of Atta and then asserted that was the man he saw with the Iraqi diplomat. Moreover, when the alleged meeting took place, FBI records showed that Atta had been in Virginia and Florida, with no evidence of an international flight between continents. A fundamental illogic also pervaded the Prague scenario. What did a simple but well-orchestrated plot that relied on box cutters, internet access, and easy ingress into US society need from Iraq alone to ensure success? Another attempt at linking was in December of 2001. Al-Qaeda senior operative al-Libi was captured by American forces and interrogated. After failing to reveal anything of value, he was turned over to Egyptian interrogators, who were able to extract from al-Libi that 2 al-Qaeda recruits had been sent to Baghdad in December of 2000 to be trained in building and deploying chemical and biological weapons. Initially, this confession was highly suspect in the CIA and the DIA, or Defense Intelligence Agency, but it fit the narrative and so it was used. The CIA in 2004 would ultimately renounce this bombshell confession, as it was extracted from under torture by the Egyptians. Next up, in June of 2002, at the behest of Bush, the CIA published a report titled Iraq and Al-Qaeda, Interpreting a Murky Relationship. This was meant to detail for policymakers the full Al-Qaeda-Iraqi connection timeline. However, it was deeply flawed, using every scrap of poorly sourced reporting. Basically, any and all unverified information brought into embassies around the world was used. Worse for Tenet in the CIA, it did not please the Bush administration either, because it did not go far enough saying that there was a concrete link between Saddam and bin Laden. One such figure who appeared to be the concrete link that the Bush administration was looking for was Zeihan. He was a Jordanian militant jihadist who had ran a training camp in Afghanistan. He was believed to have strong links to Al-Qaeda and had spent time recovering from wounds in an Iraqi hospital. However, Zeihan was not a link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein had actually attempted, unsuccessfully, to locate and capture Zeihan. Saddam's regime did not have a relationship with, harbor, or turned a blind eye towards Zeihan. Maybe the closest link the intelligence community found was that in the 1990s, Iraqi intelligence officials had met with bin Laden to offer safe haven in Iraq, but that offer was turned down since bin Laden did not want to be under Saddam's control, which is exactly what Saddam wanted by offering safe haven. Finally, the last link was when the Washington Post reported a story that claimed that Iraq had taught Al-Qaeda terrorists how to hijack planes at Salman Park. Ironically, the Salman Park base was used to train thwarting hijack attempts, and at the time of the alleged training, there were no foreigners on that base. All of these links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam were extremely weak. However, what they did do was create the illusion of a robust timeline of connections. It was only once the connections were dived into that the picture was much different than what the Bush administration had been portraying. The links between bin Laden and Saddam only mattered in the context of the bigger issue, WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration's main worry and selling point of Saddam as a threat had to do with his possession of WMDs, and that those weapons could be given to terrorists who would do untold damage to innocent lives. Bush, his cabinet, and the US intelligence services would go on a campaign to prove Saddam had reconstituted his WMD campaign after the inspectors had been banned in 1998. There was a problem though. In the lead up to invasion, the Bush administration would have to make up for their black hole of information inside of Iraq. Without real and reliable sources inside the country, the intelligence would be built on shaky foundations. The source they leaned on most to present this case was codenamed Curveball. Curveball was a German informant who claimed to have worked in Iraqi biological weapons labs. More importantly, he stated that Iraq had mobile weapons labs. That seemed to answer the CIA and DIA question of why their satellites could not locate the labs. The facilities were on wheels. There was a problem though. Curveball's story had likely been created by using the internet to learn as much as he could about the UN inspections in the 90s and about mobile labs. By doing this, he could appear to be well informed and well placed within the Iraqi WMD program. Then Curveball could receive gifts for his information. The Germans had quietly distanced themselves from Curveball after his story started to unravel, terminating him as a source in 2001. The CIA, meanwhile, never did get official access to Curveball to vet him in person. Even without ever meeting Curveball, some in the CIA wanted to believe that he was the real deal, and so his mobile lab reveals made it all the way to Powell's UN presentation as a cornerstone piece of evidence. As for evidence that Saddam had reconstituted his nuclear program after the inspectors left, two different pieces of evidence would be used to make that claim. First, in early 2002, an Italian intelligence report stated that the government of Niger had agreed to provide Iraq with 500 tons of yellow cake uranium per year. This claim did not turn out to have any merit. French companies controlling the mines would have been able to block any sale like that. Plus, trucking hundreds of tons across the blistering Sudanese desert was nearly impossible. This intel had no merit, but Cheney was a big believer in relying on it, and so it was allowed to be used by Bush in a speech in September of 2002. Secondly, for the nuclear case, was the aluminum tubes. In June of 2001, Iraq received a shipment containing thousands of carefully packed, high-strength aluminum tubes from China. Some at the CIA assessed that these tubes were going to be used to build centrifuges for uranium enrichment. However, there were others within the CIA who felt that the physical characteristics of the aluminum tubes made them unsuitable for uranium enrichment. To the Department of Energy experts, the evidence seemed plain that the tubes were going to be used for production of artillery rockets and not for centrifuge operations. These counter-arguments from within the CIA and the Department of Energy were ultimately buried. And the story told by the National Intelligence Estimate was that the tubes were for centrifuges, seeming to confirm Saddam's new nuclear weapons program. The National Intelligence Estimate, or the consensus opinion of the entire US intelligence community, had been rushed through by the Bush administration in the fall of 2002, and it was heavily tilted toward the White House's story that Saddam still had WMDs and continued to expand his arsenal. In the Intel estimate, it addressed the three main judgments for war. First, when Saddam would use weapons of mass destruction. 2, whether Saddam would engage in clandestine attacks against the US homeland. And 3, whether in desperation Saddam would share biological or chemical weapons with Al-Qaeda. All three of those were listed as low confidence in the actual reporting. In total, the document used the phrase "we don't know" 30 times, and "we know" only 3 times. It was deeply, fundamentally flawed. Even though it was heavily flawed, the NIE would be presented by Bush to the American people as facts in a speech on October 7, 2002 in Cincinnati. That speech stated that Saddam had rebuilt his chemical weapons stockpiles, had developed mobile weapons labs.
The Iraqi regime was required to destroy its weapons of mass destruction, to cease all development of such weapons, and to stop all support for terrorist groups. The Iraqi regime has violated all of those obligations.
And attempted to buy aluminum tubes for the purpose of building a nuclear stockpile.
Iraq has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes and other equipment needed for gas centrifuges, which are used to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons.
Bush also spoke vaguely about C.I.A as a senior Al-Qaeda leader who received medical treatment in Baghdad.
We know that Iraq and Al-Qaeda have had high-level contacts that go back a decade. Some Al-Qaeda leaders who fled Afghanistan went to Iraq. These include one very senior Al-Qaeda leader who received medical treatment in Baghdad this year.
C.I.A was neither a senior member of Al-Qaeda nor an ally of Saddam. Bush went on to say that Iraq had trained Al-Qaeda members in bomb-making, poisons, and deadly gas.
We've learned that Iraq has trained Al-Qaeda members in bomb-making, in poisons, and deadly gases.
Information that Egypt had extracted from al-Libi through torture. The president asked the hushed audience to imagine what Saddam could do.
Iraq could decide on any given day to provide a biological or chemical weapon to a terrorist group or individual terrorists.
An alliance with terrorists could allow the Iraqi regime to attack America without leaving any fingerprints. Gifted as a politician that he was, Bush used the very weakness of the WMD intelligence as an asset. Many people have asked how close Saddam Hussein is to developing a nuclear weapon, he observed. Well, we don't know, and that's the problem. But it was a problem with an obvious solution, arguing that the risk is simply too great that he will use them, or provide them to a terror network. Bush then landed on his national security advisor's already famous rhetorical device. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof of the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
The goal of this address was to put the fear of God into the American public. At the end of the day, the primary basis for the WMD claim by the Bush administration relied on the fact that Saddam's Iraq had lied in the past about their arsenal, and so they must be lying now. Furthermore, there was no way a dictator like Saddam would fully eliminate the main weapon that he had at his disposal. The evidence gathered by the CIA and DIA during the lead up to the invasion fit a pattern. They felt Bush had already made up his mind on war, and that their job was to support that war effort. Whenever they objected to low-confidence sources or info, men like Cheney or Rumsfeld would object that they were too focused on what was likely to happen and not enough on what could happen. Lack of imagination by the intelligence community in Cheney's mind was a big reason why 9/11 happened. Instead of focusing on the details of the evidence, the administration would play at fear. "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud," was the line that Bush, Rice, and others used to drive home the fact that if the United States did not act now, devastation awaited them. The fragility of the evidence in the case for war seems obvious when listed out. So why didn't Bush and his administration see that they were headed towards catastrophe? Well, for starters, men like Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Doug Feith had already determined that Saddam was too dangerous to be left in power. The main purpose of the evidence gathering was to convince the American people. Those men were already sold on war, and the evidence was a way to sell that war to everyday Americans. The administration felt that they needed to strike the population with the appropriate fear to act. They knew that fear could be obtained by playing up terrorist links or the WMD angle. Weren't they worried that they could face embarrassment if Saddam didn't actually have WMDs? Honestly, no. From the fall of 2001 until the invasion in 2003, the idea that Saddam had 0 WMDs did not even get brought up in any major discussions. A dictator who had relied so heavily on those weapons in the past, and who had constantly lied to inspectors throughout the 90s, it was felt that there was no way he would voluntarily give up his WMD arsenal. That is why men like Cheney were less focused on the evidence stage. They figured all the evidence of Saddam's WMDs would be discovered once they actually invaded and physically found it inside of Iraq. Cheney had become obsessed with not making the same mistake again. They cannot let another terror attack like 9/11 happen, but they must determine what the next attack is going to be. Failure of imagination had led leaders and the intelligence community to discount the Al-Qaeda threat to the homeland. Cheney was determined not to fail by missing the next escalation by terrorists. WMDs were the next logical escalation in his mind. That's how they could do true damage. What about the intelligence agencies like the CIA? Why didn't they do a better job warning the administration of the weakness of their case? Tenet seems to have figured out early on that Bush wanted to invade Iraq, and so he felt like it was his job to support that effort, or be left on the sidelines. As well, the intelligence agencies were rattled after 9/11. They had failed to adequately assess the threat to the American population posed by Al-Qaeda, leading to catastrophic consequences. What if they were wrong about Saddam's WMDs? After all, they had virtually no human assets inside of Iraq at this time. The country had essentially become a black hole of information after the US Embassy and CIA station there were shut down in 1990. Ultimately, though, most of the global intelligence agencies did assume that Saddam must have at least a minor WMD program. It was practically unthinkable that he would have flat out 0. Once a liar, always a liar, they felt. It was a setup for disaster. Now that we have covered the main evidence used to justify war, and why it was deeply flawed, let's cover some other interesting but important aspects of the Iraq invasion story. While Bush, Cheney, and Tenet continued to shape the case for war with Iraq, Rumsfeld was in charge of planning such an event. Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense, had a vision for the US military. It would be leaner, efficient, and more agile than ever before. He wanted to utilize smaller forces that could be quickly deployed and then just as quickly be removed. The less manpower used, the easier it would be to disentangle it from a conflict. Small forces striking fast and hard. Rumsfeld was adamantly against the type of large-scale buildup of forces highlighted as necessary in Colin Powell's doctrine, which was used in the Gulf War. Rumsfeld had used this smaller, more specialized force theory when the US invaded Afghanistan after 9/11. For the invasion of Iraq, Rumsfeld would use that same strategy, utilizing a light footprint invasion force to strike fast, overwhelm the enemy, and then the force would leave. What came next, you ask, after the actual invasion? Bush had put the Department of Defense, rather than the State Department, in charge of the post-war Iraq policy, and that was a critical error. Rumsfeld's defense office had very little interest in the post-invasion period. Nation building was not their priority, or responsibility, he felt. Rumsfeld's deputy, Wolfowitz, believed that the Iraqi people would handle that part, alleviating the burden on the American armed forces. He felt that once the Iraqi people were liberated, they would flock to democracy, and their new shared sense of national purpose would overcome any sectarian allegiances. In fact, rebuilding Iraq as a state wouldn't even be a US problem or cost. It would be paid for by Iraqi oil. Wolfowitz genuinely believed that Iraq under Saddam was the primary issue in the Middle East, and that people of the country would flock to democracy when given the opportunity. Most of the voices who told him of Iraq's willingness for US intervention were people who had not been to the country in a long time. One of those voices was Chalabi, who was an Iraqi exile who had been lobbying for US intervention into Iraq for over a decade. His motivation was pretty much entirely self-gain. Chalabi and his organization would feed the Bush administration information to support what it wanted to hear, like Saddam's WMD arsenal, or that the Iraqi people would flock to democracy. Chalabi was hoping to become the leader of the new post-Saddam Iraqi government. The lack of post-war planning was so bad that in July of 2002, when the CIA hosted a peace game at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which simulated US and UK forces successfully toppling the Iraqi regime in 6 weeks' time. They then quickly ran into the problem that there was nobody in line to replace Saddam once he was toppled. As we covered in the evidence section, the intelligence agencies were hyper-focused on WMDs, and not the actual makeup of the country they were about to invade. Ultimately, a lack of post-war planning fell on Bush and then Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld believed that the military would be only used for fighting wars, and post-war Iraq should be somebody else's problem, which is all the more perplexing why Bush put him in charge of shaping a post-invasion Iraq policy. Next up, did anyone in the administration push back against the Iraq invasion? Well, kind of. Colin Powell was skeptical from the outset of military intervention into Iraq. It seemed to him his colleagues were discounting the difficulties that could bog down the United States into a quagmire. Powell vented to his deputies that, if we go in, it won't be easy, and it won't be cheap, and there's not going to be a quick departure. Powell would bicker with Cheney and Rumsfeld in particular throughout the Iraqi invasion debates, while Condoleezza Rice was left to mediate these heated arguments. Where was Bush during these debates? Not around. Bush did not like meetings. He wanted tight, orderly meetings. In order for that to occur, he wanted his advisors to gather before any meeting with him in order to come to a consensus recommendation to present. Bush did not want meetings that dragged on into unresolved debates, and so he missed much of the Powell-Rumsfeld battles. Did Powell ever tell Bush directly his feelings on the invasion of Iraq? This is where the kinda comes in. Powell did meet with Bush in August of 2002 in order to warn him of the dangers of invading Iraq, telling the president all the ways that Iraq could go wrong. He said to Bush, "If you break it, you own it," and that post-war governance would be an expensive and dreary slog. It would swallow the president's whole agenda. Powell's final parting advice in the meeting was for Bush to go to the UN before invading. There was a chance Saddam would surrender his weapons and become compliant. In this meeting, Powell never did emphatically tell Bush he was against the invasion. Powell was a soldier at heart. He saw his job as executing policy and not dictating it, and so he was not one who would dissent hard against a majority. Powell's State Department would lose significant influence with Bush throughout the Iraqi war process, which is why the State Department didn't lead the post-war Iraqi policy. Other than Powell, though, Greg Newbold, the Director of Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did resign in October of 2002 due to disagreements over the Iraq strategy. Anyone else who considered arguing against Saddam's removal ran the risk of being cut out. Continued resistance to the Iraq invasion just led you to be not invited to meetings. Other than that, no major players within the Bush administration displayed serious doubts about the course they were embarking on. Outside the administration, criticism did come from a surprising source: Brent Scowcroft. Scowcroft was actually Bush Sr.'s national security advisor during his presidential tenure, and so when he spoke out against Bush Jr.'s aggressive rhetoric on Iraq, it was a shock. Scowcroft published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "Don't Attack Saddam." The article warned that Bush's invasion would be unleashing Armageddon in the Middle East. Scowcroft had actually received permission from the elder Bush to express these concerns on Iraq. Bush Jr. was livid about this public criticism, and even privately approached his father about it. What about Saddam? What did he think of Bush and his administration's increasingly more aggressive rhetoric towards Iraq? Well, for starters, with the War on Terror beginning, Saddam actually thought the United States would have to make common cause with him in order to stop the spread of Islamic fundamentalism. That illusion would be shattered by Bush's State of the Union address. Once it became apparent to Saddam that Bush was determined to remove him by force, he formulated a less direct strategy for war with the United States. Instead of trying to meet US forces in open battlefields, like he had done in the Gulf War, he would try to win a guerrilla-style war. Soon after the US invasion, Saddam would go into hiding. Once in hiding, he believed the Iraqi people would rise up to fight for him. Saddam genuinely believed that he was beloved, and although an insurgency would break out, it was not rooted in love for the dictator. In the end, Saddam had doubts the US would actually invade, believing it to be mere posturing to try to get him to step down. Saddam was never going to voluntarily leave Iraq. Egyptian officials had actually tried to bribe Saddam to leave before the invasion, which he declined. Iraq was Saddam's home and kingdom. He was not going to give that up by choice. Finally, before we go into the actual final countdown to invasion, let's cover world opinion. What did the other nations think of Bush's drive to remove Saddam? We'll start with the Middle Eastern states, who were all basically against direct military action by the United States to remove Saddam. In the spring of 2002, Cheney visited some of the Middle Eastern states to sound out their leaders on the prospect of UN intervention. In Jordan, the King Abdullah had a strong distaste for war. Jordan had been a longtime ally of Saddam, even during the Gulf War. In Egypt, President Mubarak indicated that Cairo would not stand in the way of the invasion, but did urge caution. Next, Cheney visited Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Abdullah. The Sauds told Cheney that the US should instead focus on resolving the crisis between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The West Bank and Gaza were currently embroiled in violence during the Second Intifada. Cheney wasn't interested in this crisis, though, since Clinton's administration had spent so much time and effort to try and resolve it, only to fail. When Cheney returned back from this tour, he briefed Bush. Bush was not disinterested in those countries' opinions, but would go on to remind the press after his breakfast with Cheney that this is an administration that when we say we're going to do something, we mean it. We are resolved to fight the war on terror. He continued on to say, this isn't a short-term strategy for us. We're not going to miss this opportunity to make the world more peaceful and more free. What about Israel? The Bush administration would highlight that removing Saddam would eliminate a threat to the state of Israel. And so, were they on board with the invasion of Iraq then? Well, this one is a yes and a no. Israeli leadership was led by men like Prime Minister Sharon and President Katsav. Their state definitely was worried about Saddam's possible WMD arsenal, which would be aimed at them. However, they had real concerns that the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq would destabilize the region and empower the much more dangerous regime in Iran. Before the actual invasion in March of 2003, Sharon would warn Bush that if the US did go to war with Iraq, he should make sure to formulate a viable exit strategy, prepare a counterinsurgency strategy, and should not attempt to implant democracy into the Arab world. In the Middle East, the US did have the firm support of Qatar and Kuwait, both states they intended to use as staging grounds for Operation Iraqi Freedom. Turkey, on the other hand, rejected US attempts to use their territory in order to launch a second offensive into Iraq from the north. The strongest ally to support the Bush administration during this time was the United Kingdom. Tony Blair's government was not without reservations, though. They did not want military action if it could be avoided. Their worry was that the invasion would upset the Arab world, and that the history of Iraq made the idea of democracy difficult to grow there. However, Blair deeply valued the UK-US alliance, and did feel that Saddam was threat enough that they would agree to be one of the 3 nations to send in active military support with the United States. What about the other European powers? The main 3 opponents to Bush's Iraq invasion would be France, Russia, and Germany. Chirac of France, Schroeder of Germany, and Putin of Russia, from the very outset, publicly opposed a US-led war. Chirac went so far as to threaten to use France's UN Security Council veto against a proposed resolution for war in Iraq. Condoleezza Rice's advice to Bush in the wake of this criticism was to punish France, forgive Russia, and ignore Germany. Bush felt that those 3 powers' main motivation was their economic ties to Baghdad and Iraqi fuel. He wasn't totally wrong there. Finally, China. They are the last power I want to cover. China had used Iraq as a source of much-needed fuel for its continually growing industrialization and urbanization. But they did not have a hardline against the US invasion. Chinese leadership did want to continue inspections instead of an invasion in 2003, but they did not threaten to exercise their Security Council veto on the UN resolution. France was the only state to threaten to use its Security Resolution veto in the run-up to war. Little context. When a UN Security Resolution gets brought up to a vote, any one of these 5 states have the unilateral power to veto the resolution. Those 5 are the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, China, and France. Even if the vote is 14-1, the veto power of one of those 5 can strike down the resolution. In the lead up to war, Bush considered world opinion, but ultimately it was not a swaying power on his decision making. Sure, he would have loved to create a coalition like his father had done in the Gulf War. That is why he went to the UN in the first place. But that coalition was not going to determine the mission. The mission would determine the coalition. Bush did not like the idea of leaving a defanged Saddam in power. He had spoken too highly of the importance of removing him. The Coalition of the Willing, as it would be called, included 46 members, but only 4 of these countries supplied combat forces directly participating in the invasion of Iraq. Those were the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland. Alright, now it's time for the final countdown to war. By September of 2002, Bush had all but made up his mind about Saddam. He cannot leave a defanged Saddam in power after speaking so highly of the importance of removing him. They must move forward with the invasion to remove Saddam by force. But how to do it was still a debate. Both Cheney and Rumsfeld felt that because Saddam was a threat to the United States, permission or consulting with the UN was not necessary. If it was a threat to the country, they felt the US was justified to act unilaterally. Cheney didn't hate the concept of a coalition, but he hated the UN process. He did not want the Iraq invasion to get caught up in red tape. Cheney felt Saddam presented an existential threat, and Bush had the power to remove that threat. They should not have to ask an international body for permission to do what was necessary to keep America safe. Powell and Rice, on the other hand, felt that the United States needed to present their case for Saddam's removal to the UN in order to build broad international support, a coalition of the willing. Bush ultimately sided with Rice and Powell here, and looked to win over support at the UN. The first such attempt came in September of 2002. On September 12, 2002, Bush went before the UN to press the case for a new resolution that would force Iraq to allow inspectors back. On November 8th, the resolution was passed, demanding Saddam to declare his arsenal and comply with inspections. However, consequently, the resolution also found that Saddam was already in material breach for past violations, which meant that even if Saddam surrendered his weapons, Bush could still use that material breach clause as justification for war if he wanted to. The inspectors returning brought about a host of variables of different possible outcomes. Like, what if it succeeded? What would success even look like? Or what if the inspectors, after having a free run of Iraq, found no weapons? Then what? Or if they found an immense trove of WMDs? Then what? What if Saddam proactively handed over his entire arsenal? Then what? Under which of these eventualities would the United States invade? And under which would Saddam's fate be left to the judgment of his fellow Iraqis? Would the Americans be content to see another Ba'athist step in and lead Iraq? Or an Islamic fundamentalist? Or Ahmad Chalabi? Or nobody? These scenarios ultimately were heavy concerns, but Bush already knew what he wanted to do. No matter what the inspections found, or no matter how long they took to come to conclusions, they were going to remove Saddam in the spring of 2003. Saddam was a threat, and he had to be taken care of. They were not going to stand by until the smoking gun finally materialized into the form of a mushroom cloud. The inspections were meant to be so provocative to Saddam that he faced either occupation or outright war. Essentially, Bush and his administration wanted to make the inspections such a tough pill to swallow that there was no way the dictator would fully comply. Once the inspections started, they were not very fruitful. The teams found no evidence of normal WMD facilities, or the vaunted mobile labs. More importantly though, in January of 2003, the inspection teams warned Iraq that they needed to explain the missing anthrax and VX nerve gas, something that was basically impossible since Iraqi officials had so haphazardly destroyed all of the evidence. The inspection teams not finding success set the stage for the dramatic UN presentation in February of 2003, only a month before the invasion was set to launch. Colin Powell would be tasked with presenting the administration's case for war. Powell was chosen because of the credibility and respect he commanded. Powell's prestige would be wagered in dramatic fashion in front of the world. Like I said, Powell was deeply concerned about the difficulties in the post-invasion aftermath. However, at this point he had two options: resign or agree to sell the war. Powell was too much of a loyal soldier to resign on the eve of war, destabilizing the administration in the world's eyes. Powell knew that Bush was dead set on war, and he felt that he would rather have the administration go to war with him to help rather than without him. Powell then set to work shaping the case to topple Saddam. Originally, it was proposed to Powell to deliver a three-part speech spread across several days. One part WMD, one part the terrorism angle, and the last part would be on Saddam's human rights abuses. Powell hated this approach. He felt he would be lucky to keep the UN audience's attention for 90 minutes, let alone 3 days. Instead, he would focus on the one threat that mattered to the entire world: Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. Powell would be the author of his own embarrassment in this case. The WMD case was the weakest, and so by cutting out terrorism and the human rights angles, the success or failure of this war would be determined by finding WMDs. Powell had problems with the initial intelligence of Iraq's WMD programs, and so he worked with Tenet to create a speech based on the NIE, or National Intelligence Estimate, which had been published the previous fall. This seemed to make sense since the NIE was the consensus product of the entire US intelligence community. But like I mentioned earlier, the NIE had been pushed through mainly by pressure exerted by the Bush administration in order to build the case for Saddam being a major threat. And so it was not actually a confident assessment, and instead a deeply flawed document at its core. During Powell's writing sessions with Tenet, he would constantly go line by line over evidence with him in order to ask if it sounded right or if the source was strong. Whenever Powell seemed concerned about a particular claim, Tenet would bring in what seemed to be a proper analyst who could confirm the source's validity. What Powell did not know was that Tenet had assembled a team of yes-men. In his agency, there were analysts who had serious doubts that Saddam had reconstituted his nuclear program, or that Iraq had mobile biological weapons labs. Those analysts were not allowed in the conference room. Tenet did not want any confusion. His job was to accommodate the first customer, as he called President Bush. When Powell finally finished, he was convinced that his ace in the hole was the biological weapons labs, confirmed by Curveball. Powell was walking into his own disgrace. On February 5th at 10:30 a.m., Secretary Powell stood before the international body. For the next 76 minutes, with Tenet seated to his right, he laid out the US government's case against Saddam, stating, "My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources."
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources.
Powell continued on in his calm but resolute voice. "These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence."
These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
The story Powell told in conversational language, which marked a departure from the Bush administration's evocations of madness, evil, and mushroom clouds. It was an investigator's meticulous brief of institutionalized deception and murderous intent. Powell spoke of a key source, an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer.
From eyewitness accounts, we have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails.
Who happened to be watching this speech at home with his wife in Germany. He spoke of one of Curveball's confirming sources, an Iraqi major. This reveal surprised a DIA agent who was watching the speech while waiting for a ride to take him to the Atlanta airport, and who months earlier had interviewed the major and determined that he was a fabricator. Powell spoke of decontamination trucks at chemical weapons factories.
A decontamination vehicle associated with biological or chemical weapons activity.
To the consternation of chemical weapons analyst Larry Fox, who had repeatedly objected to that questionable signature being used in Powell's speech, but had been repeatedly overruled by his superiors. Powell then spoke of aluminum tubes that most experts think were used for uranium enrichment.
Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium.
The highlight of Powell's speech was when he illustrated the danger posed by WMDs by lifting a small blue vial meant to symbolize how even a tiny amount of anthrax had shut down the U.S. Senate in the fall of 2001. Powell was referring to the anthrax scare. His point was that even a tiny amount of anthrax had killed 2 people and caused a great panic. Imagine the damage that could be done if it was produced in large quantities.
Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers, just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope.
The United Nations Special Commission had estimated that Saddam had produced up to 25,000 liters of anthrax, and that Saddam could not account for any of it.
Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
Powell's speech had left a striking impression on plenty of Americans. They had seen the effects of terror on 9/11 and were terrified of a similar or worse attack. Bush had already been able to get Congress to grant him powers to remove Saddam in October of 2002, with the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq resolution of 2002. Now, after Powell's presentation, American public opinion was firmly behind the Bush administration to act. A 2003 Gallup poll found that 64% were in favor of invasion. World opinion was not swayed, though. The UN security resolution would ultimately be withdrawn when it became worried that several permanent members of the Council would cast no votes on any resolution, thereby vetoing it. World opinion may not have been strongly in favor of Bush's decision to invade Iraq, but he felt confident his war council was behind him. Each of Bush's main advisors had varying degrees of enthusiasm for Iraq. Cheney believed that after a long string of inactions, following the U.S. Coll bombing off the coast of Yemen in 2000, the African embassy attacks in 1998, the Khobar Towers explosion in Saudi Arabia in 1996, and, for that matter, Saddam's massacre of the Shias in 1991, the United States had sent a message of timidity to the Middle East. After 9/11, in the Vice President's view, America could not afford another failure of nerve. Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor, did not agree with Cheney on much, but in January, she too believed that America's credibility was on the line. Saddam was toying with Blix's inspectors, and by extension, with international law. It was time, Rice believed, for the games to end with military action. Donald Rumsfeld observed that, absent unambiguous capitulation on Saddam's part, there were risks in not going forward with military action. Conversely, Rumsfeld had not offered any thoughts to Bush on what the risks of war might be. CIA Director George Tenet had told Bush repeatedly, in person and in writing, that Iraq had a WMD, was actively seeking nuclear capability, had sought to obtain maps of U.S. cities, and had associated frequently with Al-Qaeda throughout the years. In the meantime, Tenet had not volunteered to the president any concerns about going to war. Only Secretary of State Colin Powell had hinted at reservations. But when Bush had expressly asked him, "Are you with me?" on January 13th, 2003, the reluctant warrior said he was. What Bush did not know was that Tenet, Powell, several of the generals, and even Rice had long suspected that war was a fait accompli. Though the final decision was Bush's and Bush's alone to make, it will never be known what George W. Bush's course of action would have been if even one member of his administration had tested Bush's professed receptiveness to an argument against war. In truth, Bush had stacked his own deck, prioritizing loyalty above all else. He had surrounded himself with subordinates who believed that their job was to support the president's judgments, rather than to question them. Bush deeply believed that every individual deserved freedom. After 9/11, he regarded it as his sacred duty to protect free Americans from evil. His vision did not stop there, though. He also believed the entire world yearned to be free from evil tyranny. Democracy could foster anywhere, he thought. With US troops positioned in Kuwait, awaiting the green light, and Saddam still not giving up his perceived WMDs, Bush was in a no-back-down position. If he calls off the invasion this late, he could look weak in the war on terror, possibly emboldening more attacks. On March 17, 2003, Bush addressed the nation, giving Saddam his final ultimatum. He and his sons would have 48 hours to leave the country or face war. On March 19, 2003, shock and awe airstrikes and Tomahawk cruise missiles targeted Baghdad as Operation Iraqi Freedom began, setting the United States on a course of quagmire.
We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not falter. And we will not fail.
The actual invasion phase of the Iraq War would be quick. However, the occupation and insurgency phase would last a decade. Despite early claims of mission accomplished, the mission in fact was an epic failure, as no WMDs were found, and the United States found itself embroiled into a deadly quagmire. Ultimately, the point of this video is not to excuse the Bush administration for its decision to invade Iraq. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, Powell, among others, failed the American people. They made decisions based on assumptions instead of facts. Possibly the most egregious failure was that they wildly discounted the post-war hurdles. However, what my goal in creating this long-winded video is to give viewers more context around why the Iraq invasion played out the way it did. Simple explanations are often given to explain the intervention into the Middle East. The top two I always see are oil and Israel. Granted, both of those were factored in the ultimate case for war. However, they are meaningful in a way that I don't think gets properly elaborated on. Starting with the Bretton Woods Conference, a new financial order was created. One that was built on capitalism, free trade, and open navigation of the seas. That new world order was protected by the US Navy to ensure steady access to a variety of things, from supplies to resources to markets, but most importantly, food and fuel. Just like that, globalization was created, and with it, a dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Even after the Cold War ended, that fuel would not just stay important, but actually grow in importance, as more nations joined the global trading economy. Understanding Bretton Woods and globalization is important context when understanding oil's value to the United States. If the United States had wanted to purely focus internally, it could handle all of its own fuel needs with domestic supplies. The US also has easy access to other fuel sources close to home, like with Canada, Mexico, and even Venezuela. Simply put, the United States is well situated for oil access. However, if the United States had done that, the rest of the world would have likely collapsed into Soviet-styled communism, which would have eliminated the economic explosion that happened in the decades after World War II. Middle Eastern oil reserves have mattered and will continue to matter as long as world trade and industry grows. And it'll matter to the US as long as the country stays in a lead global power position. Oil matters, but not in the way that I feel like it's properly contextualized. Hell, Iraqi oil went completely offline after the US invasion, and did not hit its pre-war production levels until 2015. So it's not like the invasion opened up all this access to more oil. Furthermore, if the Iraq invasion was purely motivated by oil, then the United States could have just invaded southern Iraq and held the region around Basra. This area of the country accounts for roughly 70 to 80% of the country's oil, and by taking it, Saddam would have been cut off from the Gulf and his main source of revenue. US generals had pitched this plan to Bush, but Bush genuinely believed that Saddam was a menace who had WMDs, and so he had to be removed from power so that the Iraqi people could be liberated. As for Israel, the invasion of Iraq gets portrayed as the United States fighting and destroying a key Israeli enemy for them. However, by 2003, Saddam did not pose a real threat to Israel anymore. Sure, in the 80s and pre-Gulf War, Saddam was a threat, as he had developed biological, chemical, and even was trying to get to nuclear weapon capacity, while also fielding a massive standing army. But after the Gulf War and inspections, Saddam's Iraq was basically neutered as a threat to Israel. His army was in shambles, never recovering from the destruction caused by the coalition armies, while his WMD arsenal was gone. The world may not have fully known how successful the inspections had been, but they did know that Saddam's WMD capacity had been significantly reduced. Furthermore, Iraq was still an international pariah. For Saddam to try and rebuild his country's military might, he would have to utilize economic power that the country, simply put, did not have. Saddam himself, in the post-inspection period, seems to have settled into acceptance that his dream of leading a pan-Arab superpower was dead. He never did try to rebuild his WMD arsenal, and weirdly enough started to write romance novels. Israeli leadership seemed to have noticed that the defanged Saddam was not a real threat, as they advised Bush against the invasion, feeling like it would spark Arab indignation at a Western power attacking an Arab state. Israel feared that the US invasion would then lead to more terror directed at their state. Other than the problems I have with the oil and Israel angles, when I watch documentaries on the Iraq War, I feel like most of the timelines of the Iraq invasion focus primarily around the post-9/11 period, and the Bush administration's claims about Saddam having a WMD. The Gulf War, and more specifically, the 1990s inspections, are given brief coverage. To me, that is missing a massive and vital part of the Iraq story, because it makes the Saddam question seem like it wasn't an issue until Bush made it one. In fact, Bush Sr., Clinton, and then Bush Jr. all wrestled with removing Saddam. The dictator had proven to be a militant expansionist, with no regard for the suffering of his own people. Even if 9/11 never happened, the Saddam question would still have popped up due to the no-fly zones creating tensions. What 9/11 did do was change how US leadership viewed threat assessment. Containment had once seemed plausible and practical. However, in the new war on terror, where the US was fighting against decentralized, stateless, fanatic enemies, simply letting threats be contained didn't seem logical. Proactive, rather than reactive force was felt necessary to avoid another 9/11. The figures of the Bush administration, like Dick Cheney, went through a dramatic transformation after the terror attacks happened on their watch. They became determined to stamp out all threats before they could rise to the level of killing Americans. Saddam appeared to be the perfect candidate to state-sponsor terrorism. Saddam had developed WMDs in his past and had used them on innocents and then lied about it. A lot. As well, he had an axe to grind with the United States. Even though Saddam didn't try to expand after the inspectors left, that did not mean his rhetoric tampered down. Saddam had made inflammatory speeches denouncing the United States only days after 9/11. It could seem logical that if Saddam was left unchecked, he would one day work with terror organizations. That's the other element of the Iraq story that also gets overshadowed: the Saddam angle. Too often the question is asked, was the United States the bad guy in this war? They definitely weren't the good guy, but there were multiple bad guys. Saddam gassed and mass murdered dissidents, and then, when his country was suffering after Saddam's 2 wars, instead of trying to bring relief to his people by way of the Food for Oil program, he used it to enrich himself and his cronies. It gets lost in the story of the Iraq invasion how truly evil Saddam was, and how bad he was for Iraq. Instead, the focus is almost exclusively on US shortcomings, and Bush and his administration's failings. Saddam being bad does not mean that Bush was justified in invading. And to me, that is another part of the Iraq story that does not get enough coverage. George Bush. If you watch a movie like Vice, you get the impression that Dick Cheney actually ran the White House, and Bush was just a patsy who was in over his head. Bush was firmly in control of events. Sure, he granted Cheney a ton of latitude and control, but Cheney was not making moves without Bush's acquiescence. Cheney did respect the chain of command process, and deferred to what Bush wanted to do. That doesn't mean Cheney is innocent. He was an ardent hawk who had pushed for a bad war, based on critically flawed intel. Cheney is not the only member of Bush's cabinet or advisors who is guilty, though. Powell is guilty of standing by and even aiding the cause. Powell knew the problems they would face in Iraq, and never forcefully stood against it. While Rice is guilty of shielding Bush too much, she prevented the Rumsfeld and Powell arguments from reaching the White House. Bush never knew of the dissent within his own cabinet, although that was in a way by his design. Then there's Rumsfeld. He was a hawk on the same level as Cheney, but he had more impact on the success or failure of the actual Iraq intervention. Rumsfeld formulated basically no post-war plan, and then his debothification of Iraq and a light force footprint would cause a deadly insurgency to grow unchecked. Then there's Tenet. As director of the CIA, he was supposed to be in charge of properly vetting info and intelligence. Instead, he just gave Bush what he wanted to hear. Finally, there's Wolfowitz. He was a day one supporter of removing Saddam, and his campaigning and lack of understanding of the Iraqi people cannot be forgotten. Even with those other figures' guilt in the Iraq War tragedy, there is still one man whose guilt is above the rest. It was Bush, not Cheney, not Powell, not Rice, not anybody else, that made the ultimate decision to go to war. And he did so not just because he believed Saddam was an evil that needed to be removed, as he did it for revenge. Part of it was personal revenge. He never forgot that Saddam had tried to assassinate his dad. The other part of the revenge story was bigger. After 9/11, there wasn't just a feeling of fear in America, but also a burning desire for revenge. Fighting terror cells does not fill the appetite for revenge, since most of the successes and work are intelligence and covert based, in order to interdict terror groups and their operations. Winning battles or destroying your enemy is much more satisfying. Like, for example, after Pearl Harbor, the United States bombed Tokyo in the Doolittle raid. Even though that raid hit nothing of significance, it was symbolic as punching back. In the wake of 9/11, the bombing and invasion of Afghanistan didn't feel the desire for revenge. The Bush administration consistently complained that they were tired of pounding sand. They wanted to pulverize an actual enemy state. Iraq had been an enemy state of the United States since the Gulf War, and it was run by an evil man. It felt like the perfect punching bag. Finally, one last underrated aspect of why the US invaded Iraq that I want to cover is the geopolitics angle. Like I have already covered, the Middle East was and is always going to matter in a global trading world, which seems likely going forward, since roughly 80% of global trade by volume and 70% by value is transported on the ocean. Because of that, the US needed allies it could rely on in the Middle East. They would especially need Arab state alliances since that's where the oil is. Originally, the US had two strong allies in the region, Iran and Saudi Arabia. However, after the Iran Revolution, that state became a mortal enemy. Then Saudi relations with the United States slowly deteriorated after the Gulf War, only to reach an absolute low point after 9/11. Of the 19 total hijackers, 15 were from Saudi Arabia. None of the hijackers were from Iraq, it should be noted. As well, bin Laden himself was Saudi-born, and Al-Qaeda received a lot of funding from private Saudi citizens. In the new war on terror, the United States would need to figure out who it could trust in the region, and Saudi Arabia was viewed with heavy suspicion. US leadership must have toyed with the idea of an Iraq intervention on geopolitical grounds. As long as Saddam controlled Iraq, it would be an enemy, but if he was removed and the people liberated, a pro-US regime could then be installed. And now the United States could have a dependable ally in the region. Obviously, that logic makes wild assumptions of the Iraqi people acquiescing to a US puppet government. But the Bush administration made plenty of assumptions throughout the invasion process, so this feels possible and not a full reach. Ultimately, the story of the tragedy of the Iraq invasion is much deeper than I think many give it credit for. It is constantly whittled down to simple explanations like oil and Israel. When a complicated event like this gets simplified, it hurts deeply. Because when people do not understand the full story or context of a tragedy, it impacts their ability in the future to avoid similar pitfalls. I am sure this video will fire up some people who disagree with my findings and have their own take on the justifications for the Iraq War. You are welcome to leave a comment. I hope at minimum I did add some context to your understanding of the US invasion of Iraq. Thank you for watching as always. I'm Context History.